Clock. Brian Sullivan is president of the Nassau County Correction Officers Benevolent Association. Hey, Mr. President, welcome to the show. Brian, great to have you with us, sir.
Good morning, Joe. Good morning, fellas. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Well, we support what you're doing. We're hearing that the governor and the legislature are going to do away with 50A. From our listeners who aren't familiar with it, what is that, Brian Sullivan?
50A is a New York State civil rights law. It's Section 50A of the New York State civil rights law that deems the personnel records of police officers, firefighters, and correction officers as confidential and not subject to inspection or review without the officer's permission or a court order. It was passed back in the 1970s to protect the personal information of officers who testify in court and to prevent harassment or phishing by legal defense attorneys. And the main part of it was to protect the families of law enforcement officers from being from predators who could end up tracking you down because of your law enforcement work dealing with some of the predators of the world, gangbangers, things like that. If you're out there arresting or you're dealing with them in the jails, you need to have your personal information protected from people who might end up showing up on your doorstep to intimidate you.
Yeah, is this a done deal, Brian?
For all intents and purposes, it seems to be a done deal. I believe it's set to be voted on by the legislature today. The governor has said that he is going to sign it. He kind of waffled a little bit. First, he said that he was looking for reform of 50A, and then it ended up changing. And the bill that came out actually says repeal of 50A. And if you could, just allow me 1 second, what they did do in this was they said that any personal information of an officer's home, his social security number, his wives, his children's names, where they go to school, things like that, because all of this stuff is in your personnel files.
Yeah.
That is going to be redacted. So that was actually a good thing. But the problem with 50A is that they crafted it so that any unfounded or any complaints that are made about a police officer, fireman, correction officer, all has to be made public to anyone who foils it under the FOIL law. Now, if you're going to look at things realistically and with transparency, the only thing that really matters is if you were disciplined for something in one of these jobs, and you were found guilty, or there's validity to it, or you were in front of a tribunal, or you got disciplined for whatever by your job or by a court. When you start talking about allegations or just complaints or unfounded allegations, this turns into a whole different bird, because down the road, if you're involved in some incident and you're defending yourself, and next thing you have a defense lawyer come out and say, well, you worked this miserable floor in a correctional facility, or you worked in this bad area, high crime area, and you have a bunch of complaints against you, then you're painted with this broad brush that you have a lot of complaints, you must be a bad guy. And it's nothing could be further from the truth, because there are individuals out there, and I've been working in my capacity as a correction officer for 32 years next month. There are people out there that like to just make complaints, like to make allegations, because, and it's happened in Nassau County before, they don't want to litigate anything because they don't want to pay the cost of legal fees. They'll pay people, a couple of $1,000s here, $5,000 there, just to make these cases go away. So instead of spending $100,000 to litigate a false allegation or something unfounded, they'll give somebody $2,500, and you're sitting in jail. What else do you have to do but make $2,500 or $5,000? And next thing, this officer has a settlement thing that for a case that he was accused of that he didn't even get to defend himself.
Yeah.
And now down the road, you could have, if you're working in a bad section and you have a lot of complaints, like I worked in an area, it was called the BMU. We first started it, Behavioral Management Unit. It was all the violent inmates that were violent towards each other, that were violent towards staff, that were, they would throw bodily fluids at each other. What do they have out to do all day but make complaints? And then next thing, you're up for a promotion, you're up for something else, you're going for another job, and you have 10 complaints that they're foiling, and meanwhile there's no substance to any of them.
You know, it makes sense on a general level as well, Brian. So talking to Brian Sullivan, president of the Nassau County Correction Officer Benevolent Association. I don't like when someone's indicted or something is just said, and even if it's a U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York, you can't trust anything anymore, man. It's like because you're guilty until you're proven innocent, is what you're saying with this 50A. Just as
That's
simple
exactly
as that.
what it is. You're guilty until proven innocent. And we actually, I'm part of the Downstate Correction Coalition. We all work together. Nassau, Suffolk, Westchester, New York City, New York State Corrections joined us. And actually, over the weekend, the state troopers and the state trooper investigators joined with us. We wrote a memo, and we sent it to every legislator in New York State that if you're going to do this and you want to talk about transparency and you want to talk about allegations against people, why don't we make this thing full scope? And you know, we're all for transparency. You know, if somebody has a founded allegation, like I said, or you're found guilty of something, of course, have at it. Knock yourself out and do whatever you need to do. But if you're going to have that kind of transparency, that should go both ways. Let's also have legislation for the a new law for the New York State legislature up to the governor about allegations against them.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
How many former leaders of our legislature are still sitting in prison for corruption charges, for sex charges, for lying to investigators? There's two former Democratic leaders that are still sitting in jail, John Sampson and Malcolm Smith. Dean Skelos just got out of jail because of the COVID thing. You know, Joe Bruno for years went on years ago. And, I mean, if you're going to talk about we're all public officers, we're all subject to scrutiny by the public, we're all paid for them by tax dollars, then make it the same across the board. Yeah. You know, let's see all your allegations, your ethics violations that are hidden from, you know, these ethics hearings that they have in New York State. They're hidden from public view.
Meantime, they're letting criminals out on the streets, man. Unbelievable.
Meanwhile, they're letting criminals out every single day.
Brian Sullivan, keep the fight, brother. Thanks for joining us, president of the Nassau County Correction Officers Benevolent Association. Thanks for joining us,
me, Joe.
Yes, sir. All the very best. John Bramnick's going to join us. John is the leader on the GOP side at the in the Assembly in the great state of New Jersey. He will join us momentarily.